So because this gospel occurs in all, this episode is recounted in all four gospels, I've done a lot of commentary on this in other videos. For our purposes here, I'd like to highlight this parallel between what Jesus does in this episode and a similar miracle in the Old Testament. So if you turn back with me in the Old Testament to 2 Kings chapter 4, verse 42 to 44, we're going to see that this is not the first time there's been a feeding of a multitude with bread. Something similar is actually done by the prophet Elisha in the Old Testament. Now, as you're turning there, just a quick note, remember Elisha is not the same as Elijah, right? So this can get really confusing in English because the sound of the two names is very similar in a way that it's not. And so in Hebrew, it's Eliah and Elisha. So you can hear the accent falls on different syllables, and in ways that it's a little easier to distinguish them. But in English, if we say Elijah and Elisha, it sounds almost like the same name. So remember, Elijah is the first. He is the great prophet who is taken up into heaven on a fiery chariot at the end of his life when he crosses the River Jordan. His successor is Elisha, sometimes described as Elisha, right, or Elisha, to clearly distinguish him from Elisha. But even that's a little problematic because Elisha sounds like a feminine name rather than a masculine name. So I'm just going to say Elisha, and I'll try to put the emphasis on the SH so that you're clear. So Elisha is the successor to Elijah, who receives that double portion of the Spirit from Elijah, and then continues the ministry of his master, of his predecessor, of his prophetic predecessor. And so in 2 Kings chapter 4, we have a story of a feeding of a multitude that's performed by the prophet Elisha. And this is what happens. Quote, "A man came from Baal Shalisha, bringing the man of God," meaning Elisha, "bread and first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And Elisha said, 'Give them to the men, that they may eat.' But his servant said, 'How am I to set this before 100 men?' So he repeated, 'Give them to the men, that they may eat. For thus says the Lord, they shall eat and have some left.' So he set it before them, and they ate, and they had some left, according to the word of the Lord." 2 Kings chapter 4. Now, you can see, it's very easy to see the parallels between Elisha's activity in the Old Testament and Jesus' activity in the New Testament. First, you have a crowd of people. Second, the crowd of people is hungry. Third, you've got some bread, but not enough to feed them. Fourth, the prophet commands to give the bread to the people anyway. And then fifth, some kind of miraculous multiplication takes place so that the crowd, who shouldn't be able to eat from this small amount of bread, is actually not only able to eat, but able to eat in such a way that there is some left over, right? And then I guess I could add a sixth element, which is that this miracle is performed through the power of the Lord. It's something supernatural. It's something divine that happens at the Lord's express command. Right? So the parallels here are really clear between Elisha in the Old Testament and Jesus in the New Testament in the feeding of the 5,000. Right? And remember, Elisha was famous precisely because he was a prophet who didn't just proclaim oracles, but he performed miracles. Sometimes Christians forget this, that not everyone in the Old Testament performs miracles, right? Not everyone in the Old Testament was known for performing miracles. There are figures from the Old Testament like Abraham or Isaac or Jacob or say, the prophet Ezekiel or Jeremiah, just various figures. They might be known for their teaching, they might be known for their actions, but they weren't known for performing miracles, right? The miracles tend to be confined to certain key figures. Moses, of course, is the most famous of the miracle workers in the Old Testament with the plagues that are unleashed against the Egyptians, as well as other miraculous acts like striking the rock and the water flowing from the rock, things like that. And then Elisha is the other major miracle worker in the Old Testament. So Moses, Elijah, and Elisha, and especially Elisha, was known for performing these extraordinary miracles. So there are some prophets who just speak. There are others who are known for what they do, for their actions. And that's how Elijah is. Like, we don't have a book of the prophet Elisha, but we do have an account of his various prophetic signs, his miracles that he performed. And so 2 Kings chapter 4 and Matthew chapter 14, the feeding of the 5,000, are definitely parallels. And you'd better believe that first century Jews who are present, like the original audience of this sign that's being performed by Jesus, like the apostles or other Jews who knew their scriptures, would see the parallel between what Elisha had done in the Old Testament and what Jesus is doing in the New Testament very, very clearly. In other words, by means of the feeding of the 5,000, Jesus is revealing that he is the new Elisha. Right? That's another revelation of his identity. Which, by the way, makes sense because if you recall, elsewhere in the Gospels, how does Jesus identify his prophetic predecessor, John the Baptist, right? So just, for example, earlier in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 11, verse 14, he says to his disciples, if you are willing to accept it, he is Elijah who is to come, right? So if John the Baptist is a new Elijah, then it makes sense that Jesus, whom John baptizes and then who follows after him, is going to be a new Elisha, right? And just like Elisha did greater things than Elijah, so too Jesus is going to do greater things than John the Baptist, right? So there's a prophetic parallel here that plays out at the level of both figures in the Old Testament and the New Testament. For our purposes, the thing that stands out, though, is that Jesus isn't just a new Elisha. He's a new and greater Elisha, right? So Elisha performs a really remarkable miracle. He takes 20 loaves and he feeds 100 men, and there's some left over. But Jesus goes way above and beyond that, because Jesus takes 5 loaves and feeds 5,000 men, not including women and children, and there's still some left over, right? So what we see here, and this is important, is that Jesus' miracles and words in the New Testament not only fulfill the Old Testament, they not only parallel the Old Testament, they transcend it. They go beyond it. And in this case, far beyond it. I mean, it's one thing to feed 100 men with 20 loaves of bread. It's a whole nother thing to feed over 5,000 people with just 5 loaves of bread. So Jesus' power is extraordinarily, it exceeds in an extraordinary way the power that was given to Elijah, the miraculous power of Elisha. Sorry, I said Elijah, but I meant Elisha in the Old Testament. All right, so that's just the first thing here. This very, very powerful Old Testament background to Jesus' actions. And it lays a principle that's going to be very helpful for reading throughout the New Testament. Whenever you look at Jesus in the New Testament, remember, there's both continuity with the Old Testament, discontinuity with the Old Testament in terms of something new, and transcendence, where he goes beyond what there was in the Old Testament and takes things to a whole new level. All right, that's the gospel for today. What about the Old Testament reading? If you go back to the Old Testament reading, you can see in Isaiah chapter 55. Hold on, before I go there, why did I just say what I said? One of the things I've done a lot in my teaching is focus on the Jewish roots, right? The Jewish roots of this, the Jewish roots of that, the Jewish roots of Eucharist, Jewish roots of Mary, Jewish roots of Jesus, all these things. And that's really important. But it is important to recognize that the emphasis on Jewish roots emphasizes continuity, right? These things go back to the Old Testament. But whenever I do that, I'm always trying to make sure that I don't just look at the continuity, but also the discontinuity, right? So at the Last Supper, Jesus fulfills the Passover. That's continuity. He's performing, actions that were part of the Jewish Passover. The disciples prepare the Passover meal like they would have prepared any other Passover meal in the first century. But then there's also discontinuity, so that when Jesus takes the bread, for example, no other Jew in the first century would have said, "This is my body," or would have said, "This is my blood," over the wine. So there's discontinuity, there's newness. And in that newness is precisely how Jesus is transcending. He's going beyond the old and establishing something new. He's going to inaugurate a new covenant, not with the blood of bulls and goats, but in his own blood, right? So just keep that in mind as a general principle for typology. Continuity, discontinuity, and transcendence are all part of a proper understanding of the relationship between the Old and the New Testament.